Years of music teaching, I've learned a couple things. One, that is my favorite Christmas song. And two, it is also the most challenging Christmas song, and pretty much any song to sing well. So that was awesome. Thank you so much. I do have one request before I come back next week. Blueberry donuts. Whoever's doing the donuts. The first time I came here, there was a blueberry donut that I have been thinking about ever since. So it's very good to be here. Bryce is a student who was recently in my daughter's microbiology class. She tells that he always looked very tired and disconnected, didn't talk much, looked like he was going to fall asleep at any moment. And my daughter wants to get into the nursing field, and her real strength is she really cares about people. So she obviously cared enough to really notice. And she was honest with us. She said, I'm afraid this he seems like he's checked out all the time. He's probably going to fail the class. Well, it turns out that Bryce has a wife and two daughters, young family. He's working nights as a nurse's assistant, and he's taking classes during the day to meet the requirements just to apply for nursing school. Microbiology was the final class my daughter had to take to be able to apply for nursing school. And so prayers for her as her application is in, and in February we will find out, fingers crossed. But it turns out he was nothing like my daughter thought he was. So the neat part of this story is there's a lot of collaborative teaching and learning in these classes these days. Kids are asked to be in study groups, and then sometimes they even work through study and test questions as a group. Now they all have to turn in their own work, and sometimes it's turning in a test online. And in order to do this, you have to get into a computer lab and officially log into one of the computers at the school. And so her group had gotten together, and he was in their group. Bryce was in their group, and their goal was to reserve the lab and get through each person's test questions and get them all submitted by the end of the day. It took longer than expected, and I think they only got about halfway through. And Bryce was one of the first ones that took the test as part of the group. So he was in. He was already in. And he had to go to work that night as a nurse's assistant. And it turns out that, once again, this student group had to reserve a computer lab to go in and to finish the tests for the rest of the kids. Bryce was done. He was going to work all night and probably go home to his family and probably actually spend most of the day sleeping. When they arrived the next morning, Bryce was asleep on a bench at the school. He had already reserved the lab, and they walked right in, and he stayed and helped his classmates finish the test after working all night. He could have called it good and gone home, but he worked all night, reserved the lab, slept on a bench until his classmates got there. He didn't have to show up, but he did anyway. About 10 years ago, my mother-in-law moved to Owasso. Her oldest daughter lives there. Her first grandchild lives there. And her favorite son-in-law lives there. So, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, I guess. So she loves us, and she wanted to be near us. She moved from Blackwell, Oklahoma, in north central Oklahoma. When you love someone, you show up. She's been there for Claire's concerts and big moments in our lives. She cooks for us. She's shared a vacation home with us for over 20 years. And yet, she often stays in the background out of respect for our private matters and our family. And I've always thought that was a little bit puzzling. I love that she does that. But she doesn't have to. I'm glad she's here today. Why? Because we love her and she's part of our family. And she shows up because she loves us and wants to be near us. My mom is similar. My mom has been on planes to watch my marching band at Owasso perform in the Rose Parade. She just shows up. Big life events. I don't know how you guys feel, but I turned 57 on Wednesday here in a few days, and mom is still mom. No matter how old I get, mom is still mom. We love her, and she loves us. And she shows up because she loves us and she wants to be near us. From the beginning, God has been trying to be near us for the same reason. Because he loves us. It's that simple. Talking to Bill in the back earlier, and he said, sometimes we make it complicated. It's simple. So, there's a dilemma, however. The Bible is full of stories where God wants to be near his people, but the people fail to see it. So this message is in two parts. I'm going to try to bridge the end of this week into the beginning of next week. So if I do a good job, come back. If it's empty, I'll know I didn't. But as you know, most stories have a better ending than a beginning. And the best part is going to be next week, so I hope you're back. To make it connect, I'm gonna start at the almost end of the story. In Matthew 12:6, Jesus tells the Pharisees, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. Now, he was talking about himself, of course. And to get some context, we're going to take a look at why this was so important. Why did he need to say he was greater than a building? Common sense says that a person is more important than a building, but there's more to the story. So how did the temple get here? So we're going to do a really fast history lesson, and I'm going to do my best not to get too far into the weeds. But the first temple was actually called the tabernacle. It was portable. And as you recall, God delivered through Moses the Israelites from Egypt, and they went on the road. And they had to travel through the wilderness. But before that, there was the plagues and the long time it took to convince Pharaoh. They'd been through a lot. And then when they finally got out of there, they were lost in the wilderness. That didn't seem like part of the plan to them. But, they went to the Red Sea, were delivered there when God parted the sea. And then finally God said, I'm going to give you guys some guidelines. And they arrived at Mount Sinai, and Moses received the 10 Commandments on behalf of the people. And again, this was because God wanted to be near his chosen people. He loved them. He gave them structure. He wanted to keep that relationship intact. They got hungry and complained the food in Egypt was better than what they were eating. God provided manna and quail. And some of them still weren't happy. But God continued to show up out in the wilderness. He showed up to take care of them. And so, the next act was he's asked Moses to have the people build a tabernacle. Now, a tabernacle is the Hebrew word for tent. It was temporary. And in Exodus 25:8, God told Moses, have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. I will dwell among them. God wanted to be near them. So, of course, it had to be portable because they're traveling around in the desert. They're pretty much lost, but they're trying to trust. And so the tent could be torn down and rebuilt every place they stopped. It would be considered the earthly dwelling place of God. God, again, wanted to be near his people. Now, you probably know that the 10 Commandments eventually ended up in an Ark of the Covenant. And you can read in Exodus in explicit detail, almost to the point where you might fall asleep like Mike was going to, because if there's so many chapters of the details of this tabernacle in the Ark that I check out when I go back and read it. I mean, I don't think it's important that we know all those details. I think it's important that we know there were great details that God requested when they built it. And this ark and the 10 Commandments represented God's covenant with his people. God said, you are my chosen people. It set them apart from all other nations. Over the course of time, as they traveled and they eventually found their way, The tabernacle found a more permanent location in Shiloh, which is about 45 minutes north of Jerusalem. I actually went there this summer. And believe it or not, what they believe is the actual foundation of the temple structure and the surrounding town is part of an archaeological dig right now. And when we were there, you could see the rock foundation of the walls that the tent was set upon. And it is measurable to the exact dimensions of the tabernacle in the Bible. It is a fascinating thing. And they only discovered this in 2017. It's one of the newest discoveries, and it's got lots of evidence there. I won't go into all the details there, but there's plenty of evidence that that was actually the site in Shiloh. The wall dimensions match. There were convincing details. And Shiloh became the center of worship for this tabernacle for 369 years. So it eventually kind of found a landing place. And people came from all over. Again, it was God's way of being near his chosen people. So far, so good, right? You know, the people complained a bit about the food, and they did struggle with idol worship. Like I said, I'm not going to get too far in the weeds. And they didn't like how long they had to be in the wilderness, but they seemed to be on the right trajectory overall. But eventually, as people do, they caved to the ways of the world. So again, once this tabernacle landed in Shiloh, the people, wanting to be like all other nations, again, not thinking we are God's people, we don't need anything else but God. We want to kind of be like everybody else. So they requested to the prophet Samuel that they have a king. Now, we already know they had a king. What do they need a king for? Well, we want to have a king because everybody else has a king. They eventually desired to be like everyone else, even though God had said, "You are my chosen people." They didn't get it. In 1 Samuel 8, verses 4 through 8, it says, "So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, 'You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have.' But when they said, 'Give us a king to lead us,' this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, 'Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you that they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you.'" Again, even though God desired to set his people apart and be with them, they wanted to be like everybody else. Sound like a familiar story in our world today? It's rampant. So they got a king. Saul was appointed by God through Samuel to be king. Not going to get in the weeds, but it got messy. A member of his army, David, killed Goliath, and Saul became very jealous of that. And even Saul's own son, Jonathan, favored David in that moment. And Saul lost his mind. It was his downfall. So eventually David would become king. Now we're familiar with that story. He was better than Saul, but it still got messy. He, amongst of all the great things he did, including the wonderful Psalms that he wrote, the songs that he wrote, not only to petition to God for favor, but to acknowledge his own shortcomings. He offered a lot, but eventually he lusted after a woman, Bathsheba, whose husband was in the army, and he killed her husband. You know, he owned his shortcomings, and he wrote many Psalms, but it was still messy for David as well. Now, do you remember back when, just a few minutes ago, when I said God thought having kings was a bad idea? We've got proof. He was right. And God was perfectly fine with his moving tabernacle. Well, apparently these kings had other ideas. So, it's well written in the Bible that there was one Jewish God, a living God. And all the other nations that had temples, they were for multiple gods. And throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, God says, there is only one God. I am the one you should worship. I am the one that's here for you. But again, they wanted what everybody else had. Everybody else had a temple. And, they were more permanent versions of the original tabernacle. Eventually, King David felt that, God deserved to live in something better than a tent. It does sound kind of accurate, doesn't it? Now, in this Christmas season, have you made the connection that God was just fine in a tent? Jesus was just fine in a barn. Those weren't the important things. The buildings weren't the important things. In 2 Samuel, the Lord said this to David, "Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved all the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people in Israel, why have you not built me a house of cedar?" You see, God was fine with temporary. In fact, the plan at that point was just a temporary plan anyway. His plan for David, however, was forever. For we know it's from the line of David that we find Joseph, Jesus' father. And you could track that in the genealogy in Matthew and how that connects. David still wanted to build the temple. God said, "No way. You lusted after this woman. You killed her husband. You've got blood on your hands. You can't build my temple." So he made plans for his son Solomon through Bathsheba to build a temple. He forged ahead anyway. He helped him raise the money. And when he became king, he started building the temple. Now, Solomon's king, when he was king, he did well at first. He prayed to God. He did what God asked. And what did God give him? We all know, wisdom. We've all heard of the wisdom of Solomon, and we've all heard of Solomon's temple. Now, his temple was glorious. You're probably familiar with Solomon's temple, and you can read more about it in 1 Kings. Solomon invited God into this new permanent temple, and God said, this is really beautiful, but, this is fine, but you still have to obey me. You still have to acknowledge me for the wisdom I've given you. You still have to share that wisdom with everyone else. But the temple is not really part of my plan. And he said, if you disobey me, I will tear this temple to the ground. See, the temple, though beautiful, it was not necessary. As God predicted, this temple was much like all the other pagan temples of the other countries. Solomon wanted to be just like other nations, rather than recognize God's desire to be with his chosen people. And eventually, Solomon built over 700 more temples, one for each of his 700 wives. And not only did he worship the gods of those temples, he worshiped God at the same time, knowing all along that God said, I am the king. I am the true living God, and there's only one of me. So, the once mobile Jewish God, now he had a tent, he went camping, he went around. He had a place in a building now. And I can only imagine that God thought, if I can kind of get God confined into this temple, I can do whatever I want outside the temple. But as you know, God cannot be confined to a building. Of course, God's going to follow through on what he said. This was not acceptable. Eventually, in 587 BC, the temple was torn to the ground by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. But as you can guess, God wasn't at home. God is everywhere. So once again, humanity failed to accept that God couldn't be confined to just one place. He was near and far and everywhere. God said, I am your king. But his people said, we still want a human king. He said, I'm happy in my tent. But the king, the human king, said, I'm going to build you a temple anyway. Did you catch that God gave lots of details? I mentioned it in Exodus. There are numerous chapters of all the details of the tabernacle because that's what God wanted, okay? God did not give any of the details to Solomon and his temple. Solomon was wise and he employed lots of people and they made a beautiful structure. But God didn't have any hand in that. If God wanted a temple, he would have given detailed plans. God's plan is always better than our plan. When as you get older and everybody knows that there's one place you go to all the time, and that's the bathroom. Okay? And I just happened to notice in the bathroom this morning something that was really relevant from Proverbs. It said, happy is the man that finds wisdom, Solomon, and the man that finds understanding. Although Solomon was wise, he did not have understanding. Now, if you know Proverbs, you know that it is widely believed that Solomon wrote Proverbs. He wrote something very awesome and yet didn't follow through on it. Solomon had wisdom, he just didn't have understanding. I find that interesting. So, you guys know me by now. This is my 4th or 5th time here, and I like sports. So I think about it like this. In baseball, I like to think of this scenario right now. God is on the mound. He's got a great curveball, but he's going to throw fastballs right down the middle of the plate. Now, if you know anything about baseball, a good hitter or even an average hitter, if he knows a fastball's coming down the middle on the next pitch, he's probably going to make contact. That's just the way baseball works. If you know what's coming, you're probably going to get the bat on the ball. And so here was God standing on the pitcher's mound, throwing fastballs and saying, hey guys, fastball down the middle, here it comes. Even an average hitter can hit that. I remember one movie that I cannot turn off if it's on, if I'm flipping around on TV, is Bull Durham, a baseball movie from a long time ago. Who remembers that movie? Kevin Costner is the catcher, and he's really mad at his pitcher. And his pitcher's about ready to pitch a 2-hit shutout, and he shakes off one of his signals. And he looks over at the batter and says, this guy, he's pitching a 2-hit shutout, and he's shaking off my signals. What's up with that? And he tells the guy the pitch that's coming. And, of course, you know what happens. Hits it a mile out of the park. I think it hits off the brick building over in right field, if I recall in the movie. And Kevin Costner walks out to the mound, and he looks over there and kind of, mockingly does this. And he goes, boy, anything traveling that far, it should have a stewardess on it. And it was a funny moment, and his pitcher learned to listen. But I still think of it this way. He said, Saul, King Saul, fastball down the middle, strike one. King David, fastball down the middle, here it comes. It's coming right down the middle, strike two. Solomon, you're the wise guy. You're the guy with the wisdom. Fastball down the middle, here it comes, swing and a miss. Strike three. God told them exactly what to do and exactly how to do it, and they still struck out. See, kings were not God's idea. Neither were temples. Once again, his people couldn't see it. Even today, sometimes we can't see it. Even today, we often miss it. When I was in Israel this summer, as I mentioned before, I went in dozens of houses of worship all over the Jerusalem area and up north near the Sea of Galilee, and they were the most beautiful places I've ever been in my life. And I really felt connected to God there. But God didn't need those buildings. I still look fondly back at those pictures and in awe of the beauty, but that's not what God's all about. God isn't about a building. I know those buildings are not necessarily. But as we know, God doesn't give up. He never gives up. He keeps showing up, as you recall from the beginning of the message. Jesus said, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. See, for a long time, God operated in a mostly transactional sense. You can track through the Old Testament. God says, if you do this, I'll do this. If you don't do this, I'm not going to do this. Or if you don't do this, I will do this. It was very transactional. But the game was about to change. God's effort to be near his people was about to go to a whole new level, which we will talk about next week. Aren't you glad that despite all of our shortcomings, God still pursues us? If you'd like to respond to this pursuit and choose to accept God's plan for you, You're invited to come up during this closing song, which we will sing now, and I will close us out with prayer afterwards. I surrender all.